Hello, everybody. While we're getting my presentation loaded up, I'm Tim Seipel, Cropland Weed Extension Specialist at MSU. I wear a lot of hats, do a lot of different weed trials, weed management across the state. I've done a little bit in canola, not too much. Karen mentioned the pro-amide, one of BASF's molecules. I think they're mostly bringing out, usually used as curb herbicide in Europe, really common in winter canola. So we've been looking at a little bit if we can incorporate that into our cropping systems, our winter canola especially. It's actually a herbicide that works better in the cold than it does in the warm. So it seems like it might be well suited to incorporate into some of our winter canola systems in Montana. So I thought I would speak a little bit about drought and weeds and herbicide carryover as we go forward. Maybe looking back a little bit and looking into the future as we go forward. I might look left, everyone else has been looking right to the screen. So this was the two biggest, I guess this is probably my theme every year. I've been doing this job since 2018, I think the middle of July of 2018. So drought and weeds are a big topic in Montana. It was a big topic this year. There we go. So really my most common question I think I got this year, how does the drought affect weeds and weed management? And how do we think about it when we go forward? And really it has two parts. And since I'm just talking for the first half here, I cut some things out. So hopefully it's stitched back together pretty well. But part one is really the biology and ecology of the weeds and what happens to weeds during these drought years that we have. And then part two is how do we adapt our management? What do we do? How do we think about it when we go forward with that? So I cut some of it out in the beginning, but we'll just step through. Our three most common companions in Montana, probably wild oat, kochia, and cheatgrass, and how they each respond to drought. And it's actually pretty interesting. So wild oat, it'll go dormant in the seed bank, right? When wild oat falls off the plant, it is completely dormant. There's very little you could do to get that plant to germinate. In the greenhouse, when we do herbicide screening for resistance with wild oat, we actually take the individual caryops off, we peel them, and then we poke a hole with a needle through it to get it to germinate. So that's how we do some of our herbicide resistance trials in the greenhouse. It's a real pain, but that's the only way that we can really do it. Otherwise, if you let that seed sit for a year, it'll germinate 90%. But it's a little bit too late to come back and a year later and rescreen it. So we poke holes in it with a needle. So those long-lived seeds, those will come back when the drought's over, right? They'll be sitting in that seed bank and they're ready to come out. Kochia has a little bit different strategy. And kochia is a species that's really drought tolerant. And also, I think I have my next slide or my slide after really highlights how drought resistant kochia is. It's pretty tolerant of saline. It has a short-lived seed bank, and I'll show you that in a second. And then lastly, in that cheatgrass or downy brome, that's our winter wheat weed companion. It really follows the precipitation year to year. These two graphs right here, this is the annual brome population dynamics in red, and the blue line is the precipitation at Fort Keogh and Miles City. And you can just see the cheatgrass just really tracks the precipitation patterns. So we'll see more, we get rains in the fall, September to November. That's when you get the cheatgrass that really germinates and goes quick. Let's come back and talk about kochia a little bit. It's really one of the most problematic weeds that we deal with, maybe in pulses more than in canola, because we at least have some Liberty Link and some other traits, herbicide traits. But kochia germinates starting second week of April all the way till the end of June. And so when you get those flushes, of germination that come across the season, the most important weed control trait to have there is that residual herbicide in the system. And when you have that residual herbicide, you get a longer window in here that actually kills those seedlings as they emerge. So it's easier than trying to chase it up with a Roundup again, which if the Roundup works in those cases. So kochia is pretty tough when it comes to managing it because it has that long germination window, But kochia's weakness, and this is actually all germination data from kochia, and I cut the bottom of the graph off just so we could see it. That's a 1 year, half a year, or no years, half a year, 1 year, 1.5, 2 years on the bottom. And that's the amount of viable seed over here. So 100% viable, 0% viable. So if you want to clean up your kochia problem, the weakness in kochia to really get after it is if you can keep it clean from 2 years and keep your neighbor's kochia from blowing into your field, then you've really cleaned up some of your kochia problem. That's the weakness of kochia, is that it has a very short-lived seed in the seed bank. And that's unlike wild oat in that contrast. So that's how it responds to drought. But kochia puts it puts everything in one basket. Kochia has to germinate. If that seed only lives 2 years, you have to imagine that seed has to germinate. And actually, kochia is really drought tolerant in that context. And this is a paper that kind of blows me away. And so if any of you guys are using flumioxazin, which is Valor Chateau that's out there, or indaziflam, and indaziflam is a different molecule, not labeled for crop. But if you're using Valor, some people say, oh, you know, I think I have resistance to Valor in my kochia. It just came up really bad in the spring. But this graph shows it right here. And the conclusion I copied out of the paper: kochia can germinate at soil moisture potentials below what it takes for Valor to be active in the soil. That's how drought tolerant kochia is. So it's a tough plant to manage in those contexts. Here, the graph actually shows these are the control plants. So with less soil moisture potential, negative 400 kilopascals, I think is what it is. The plants are as large as the control treatments, the ones that were treated with Valor. And that's because that seed germinates at moisture levels below what it takes to activate Valor in the soil. So we have to think about that. That's pretty tough. There's a guy at CSU who's actually trying to incorporate kochia genome into some of our drought tolerance. So the other part of the weed biology that we had, and we had difficulty in managing weeds this year, were those weeds were under physiological stress. And so less water in the plant is transpired, less water equals less translocation in some of the herbicides, right? If you're not pumping water through that plant, you're not going to necessarily get that herbicide to the site of action where it needs to go. So for the sake of time here, to give Brian his time in the end, we'll keep it moving. But so herbicide performance can be affected by drought. And I showed you the flumioxazin, the Valor there, the pre-emergent herbicides. Well, we use these pre-emergent herbicides in a lot of our cases, whether we're switching in our rotation. And so most of these pre-emergent herbicides are actually coming, you know, we put them down on the soil and then they come up in the plant in the xylem and they get taken to the site of action in the plant. So if the plant is not moving a lot of water, you get less translocation of that herbicide and you can get less poor weed control in that context. But the real question that we have to think about in the next year or so, and this takes a little bit to explain, is what happens to my herbicides after I apply them to the surface? And this is what we call the half-life of a molecule. This is the half-life graph. So the full concentration up here, that's time down here on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis here is the herbicide concentration. Here's when we go out and apply it in the field. Well, we eventually want that herbicide to degrade and go away so that we can recrop it with something else. And so when we have these dry years like this, the two most common ways herbicides are broken down are by microbes in the soil and by acid hydrolysis, which is a chemical reaction. But it's called hydrolysis for a reason, because it's like hydro. It needs water to really break that thing apart. So when we have these dry years, we want that herbicide concentration to decline to maybe below this red line right here, because that's our safe concentration that we can recrop something with. But when we lack water, a lot of times we can push that out so that we don't get to that safe recropping interval as quickly as we would like to get to it, especially with our residual herbicides, and especially with the clear field EMI herbicides that we're using in canola. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. And I realized that when I was putting this together the other day, I didn't talk about what comes after canola. I just talked about how these non-clear field varieties of canola get affected. But basically, we're in this situation this year where we have a dry year. It's kind of hard to predict where we'll go, but there's the potential to have more herbicide carryover than we've had in the last few years, or maybe in wetter years. So herbicide carryover is how long that molecule is sticking around in the soil, right? We want it to be there for a certain time, and then we don't want it to be there anymore because we want to plant something else in. And so here's the plant back intervals for a whole list of herbicides for canola out of the NDSU production field guide. Now, we should note that actually soil pH and the amount of organic matter combined with precipitation really affects these plant back intervals that we have from year to year. So it's really important to know that, but we can have some long breakdown. Let me see if I can see these a little bit better. So Ally, I think going off memory, since I can't see it and it's probably hard for you guys to see, I think it's about 34 months, right? Before you can come back with some of these sulfonylurea herbicides. With the clear field beyond, I think is in there too, and authority, those are up almost in the 2-year range. Sulfentrazone, which is Spartan charge, coming to canola with those can also be in that 2-year range. And so when we have these really dry years, we have to think about what we put down 2 and 3 years ago into some of our fields. It's really important to keep that history and read the labels in those contexts. So herbicide carryover. So drought really increases this, and it's because the herbicide half-life can be longer in the soil, be affected by things like sulfentrazone and saflofinacil, which are Spartan and Sharpen. And this is injury on lentils. But we also have to think about the group 2 herbicides in there, Ally and Maverick, probably some of the 2 most common herbicide injury symptoms I see come into the Scudder Diagnostic Lab. And then when we use, we'll skip these. And then when we use our clear field varieties and we use these IMI group 2 herbicides, those can have really long plant back intervals. So much so that I think BASF issued a memo this year in Canada, just across the border. They discussed that, you know, some of these IMI herbicides are going to stick around much longer than we expected them to, and to really think about what you grow next year and what that interval's coming is going to be. So I think it's important to think about what you have in your fields, especially if you're trying to go to a pulse or something like that. Or I think, yeah, pulse would be pretty tough, but I think, you know, thinking about these herbicide carryover risks, they also put this out in Saskatchewan that with this dry year that we just had, herbicide injury risk is going to be greater next year as we go into it. So we'll have to keep that in the back of our heads as we think about planting decisions and what we want to plant and types of varieties that we're making choices about. So my take homes to get us closer back on time here. Herbicides are primarily broken down by moisture and temperature, and they have to be adequate. Moisture was lacking, and so that's increasing the risk that we're going to have in this next year going forward. Some of the herbicides carry more risk than others, obviously, so you have to read really close at the label and realize how your soil pH, or the amount of organic matter that you have out there, can interact. And then give yourself as much time as you can in the plant back intervals. I know it's tough. Everyone wants to go out and plant early, but sometimes we need the soils to warm up and a little bit more herbicide to break down as we go through the year. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions about canola, weeds, herbicide carryover, or anything. And if not, I can hand it off to Brian.
All right. My name is Brian Jenks, weed scientist with NDSU. I actually work in Minot. I'm not in Fargo, so I'm only about 2 hours east of the Montana border. Want to apologize up front. I just getting over a bad cold, so I'll try and keep the sniffles and coughs to a minimum. Also, a disclaimer. I'm going to give you my experience in North Dakota. What I say may or may not apply to you exactly. I'll tell you what we're doing, and you can try and apply it where you can. And then also, hopefully I won't misspeak on any differences in labels between North Dakota and Montana and other states. Okay, the herbicide systems that we primarily use in canola in North Dakota are Roundup Ready, Liberty Link, and Clearfield. And right now, I would say over 80% of the acres are Liberty Link. Probably close to 15% or so are Roundup Ready, and then a small number or small percentage of Clearfield. The main reason for the greater Liberty acres, I believe, are good genetics. But when Liberty came with the pod shatter trait, the resistance to shattering, that really took over the acres. As far as weed control goes, when we use Roundup, we apply it once or twice. I'd say it's normally applied twice, especially if we've got some perennial weeds like Canada thistle. Liberty is typically applied once, but certainly could be applied twice. And then in Clearfield, Beyond would typically be applied once. There are not, to my knowledge, there are very few conventional acres or varieties, the non-Roundup or Liberty resistant varieties out there. And so we primarily deal with Roundup and Liberty. I typically get very few questions about weed control in canola, primarily because Roundup and Liberty have done a very good job. However, because we're starting to deal a lot more with Roundup resistant weeds, and obviously the big one is Roundup resistant kochia, also Roundup resistant horseweed, which I don't think you have further west, but kochia is the big one. Liberty does very well, or can do very well, on kochia. However, Liberty, as you probably know already, Liberty really needs warm, humid, sunny conditions to work well. If it's cold and cloudy, Liberty's not going to work very well. And most of my talk today, I'm going to focus on kochia because it's a huge issue for us, and I know it's a huge issue for further west as well. But the key for me with Liberty and is apply it when you've got those good growing conditions and when the kochia is small. If you apply Liberty to 6-inch kochia, you're going to miss it. I would target no more than 3-inch kochia for Liberty. So if you can hit Liberty when you got 3-inch kochia, warm, sunny, humid conditions, you should do very well. On the right side of the screen, I show some of the weeds that we deal with: kochia, pigweed, lamb's quarters, buckwheat, mallow, some winter annuals, horseweed, prickly lettuce, chamomile, hawksbeard. And then we certainly do have resistance issues with green and yellow foxtail, wild oat, barnyard grass, and then the perennials, dandelion, Canada thistle, and foxtail barley. One other point I want to make with Liberty Link is most of the time we do apply Liberty with Select or clethodim. And that's because Liberty is not the greatest herbicide on grasses, especially larger grasses. If you're spraying Liberty on wild oat, you want that wild oat to be no more than 2 to 3 leaf. And then also Liberty is very weak on yellow foxtail. And so having the Select in there with the Liberty helps provide that extra grass control. Now, why do I specifically say Select? It's primarily because we have a lot of resistance in our state to Assure 2. Whereas, in fact, in the testing that I've done over hundreds of samples, 75% of the samples I've tested have been resistant to, this is green foxtail, and wild oat, about 75% have been resistant to have been resistant to Assure 2, but only a small percentage have been resistant to Select. And so that's why we typically are using Liberty with Select. Okay, so these herbicides that I'm talking about are post-applied, but what about soil applied? I want to make a point that we, North Dakota, Western North Dakota, Montana, some parts of Idaho and Washington are very dry. But I show this slide just to show that the soil applied herbicides do help us more than we think they do, even in dry conditions. And I use this slide with corn to show that right here on our untreated, this is a lot of yellow foxtail, but there's some green in there too. And you can see with balanced atrazine applied pre, we got some control, but once we threw some harness in there, we got much better control. But we didn't get rain for about 2 weeks after planting. And it was only about 41/100ths rain. So even though that was a low amount of rain, that was just enough to get the herbicide activated, and look at the effect on the corn. So sometimes we think we're not getting that activation from the soil applied herbicide, but I do think we're getting it more often than we think. Okay, soil applied herbicides. In canola, we still can use Sonland and Preplant, and I'll show in a minute how we use Sonland, how we can make it more effective. I see on the Spartan Charge label that in spring wheat that you can use Spartan Charge in Montana. We can't do that in North Dakota. In dry peas, you can use Spartan, Prowl, and Metribuzin. And obviously, for any soil where you use Spartan and Metribuzin, you need to know your soil characteristics. Otherwise, you can do some severe damage to your peas or another crop. With chickpeas, Spartan and Prowl, lentils, Prowl and Metribuzin. If you're in the eastern part of Montana, probably grow some safflower, where you could use Prowl, Sonland, Preplant, or Spartan. Anthem Flex or Zidua can be used in some situations, but I don't think they're going to be very effective in dry conditions, especially in no-till where you've got a lot of crop residue. Okay, keys to making Sonland work. You want to choose your cleanest fields. Use the previous fall, use a pre-harvest glyphosate to clean up some of those weeds, especially the perennials. Sonland is best used in the fall. It can be used in the spring, but it's much better in the fall so that you can take advantage of that fall winter moisture activation. It's best applied as late as possible in the fall, preferably using granules, because liquid tends to get tied up in the residue. No-till, typically, we see decent control with Sonland with the granules. If you're in conventional tillage, then yes, you could probably make it work even in the spring. But in Western North Dakota, we've got almost no conventional tillage. It's all no-till, and so we're using granules. No-till at least 3 years. The reason for that is so that the seeds in a no-till situation are mostly on the surface. They're not distributed through the top 6 inches. You can incorporate with a harrow, but it's not that effective. Hopefully you get some rainfall. Residue distribution is very important so that it's evenly spread. And then in the spring, the only time we ever see some injury is when we have cold, wet springs versus a warm soil. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Valor. And I want to reiterate that you cannot apply Valor in front of canola. Do not apply Valor in front of canola. The reason I'm going to talk about Valor is we've been using it as a fall application in front of other crops, such as small grains, pulses, soybeans, etc. In Montana, you can apply it in the spring if you choose with this Valor Easy label that ends in EPA number 221 in front of peas, lentils, chickpeas, or fava beans. Dry pea and chickpea, 2 ounces, they claim control of kochia or control of some weeds in general. With in lentils, 1.5 ounces suppression. However, there's this big fat bold letter, red letter warning that says that in some conditions, primarily heavy rain, cool conditions near crop emergence, you could see injury. And so keep this in mind if you do apply Valor in the spring in front of dry peas, lentils, chickpeas, fava bean. Again, do not put it in front of canola or you will kill your canola nearly 100%. Okay, and I'll get into later how we use it in the fall rather than the spring. We rarely apply Valor in the spring. The only about the only place where we apply it in the spring is in front of soybeans, but you can apply it in front of those crops according to that label. Okay, the problem with kochia is we're starting to see resistance to not only Roundup but also starring. So where we've been using wide match for many years, we're relying on starring to control the kochia. Well, we know we've got group 2 resistance to herbicides like Express and Raptor. We've got a little bit of low level resistance with dicamba and starine, and definitely more resistance to Roundup. So what we're seeing with kochia is we need to use 2 or 3 different modes of action now. We cannot rely anymore solely on starine to control our kochia, and certainly can't rely on Roundup to control the kochia. So in our spring wheat, we have a product, for example, Husky FX, which has 3 different products in it: bromoxynil, pyrosulfatol, and fluroxapyr. So it's got 3 modes of action to control kochia. This has been working very well for us in our spring wheat. However, you have to be careful. As with any herbicide, you have to know the rotation interval. The Montana rotation interval with this product in front of dry pea and lentil is 18 months. So keep that in mind. That may not work in your crop rotation. Another option could be a Talinor plus starine. Again, 3 modes of action, but Talinor, like Husky FX, will have some very severe rotation restrictions. One product that may have will have less rotation restrictions is something like Kochivore Clean Sweep, which has a 2,4-D bromoxynil fluroxapyr. So 3 different modes of action. 2,4-D is obviously not the best on kochia, but you got 3 modes of action working to help control kochia in a spring wheat. Okay, now I'm going to come back to Valor again, and I apologize, I'm rushing because I don't have a lot of time here. Here's where here's what we're seeing as the advantage to Valor in the fall. Now, what we do is we've been applying Valor as late as possible. We applied it October 9th. And here we had several other herbicides. So all these herbicides were applied October 9, glyphosate plus 2,4-D, Clarity, Sharpen, etc. But here we got Valor. And in June 7 with kochia, we had about 63% kochia control. This is Russian thistle, about 80% Russian thistle control. So what we're doing is we're thinning out that kochia population in the spring with a fall Valor. Valor does not give us complete control of kochia throughout the season. But think of what happens when a kochia plant drops its seeds. It drops it in a small area so that you've got hundreds or even thousands of seeds per square foot. And in this case, we got about 60% kochia reduction. Now, this was a very dry fall this past year, and so there was not a lot of activation there. But we've done this for several years, and typically we see about 60 to 90% reduction in kochia in the spring where we apply the fall Valor. And so if you can reduce that population of kochia that's growing in the spring, then that makes your burn down in the spring much more effective, because instead of having to control hundreds of plants per square foot in the spring, you've got 60 to 90% fewer plants to control in the spring. So you get better coverage of those plants in the spring that are germinating. So on the left here, we see where there's no fall Valor. On the right, you can see we reduced the population. So there's no Valor, and then there's the Valor where we reduce the population. Okay, going through this quickly. Why don't we use, we know Spartan is actually better in the spring on kochia than Valor is. So why don't we use Valor, or why don't we use Spartan in the fall instead of Valor? Well, here's why. Valor is less water soluble. Spartan is more water soluble. In our trials with Spartan in the fall, we see actually less control on kochia than we do with Valor. And I think it's because Valor tends to stick in that soil surface better because it's less water soluble. Whereas Spartan, being more water soluble, will tend to move, and we see less control in the fall. We also use Valor because it's more effective on winter annuals, and it's shown to be a little bit more effective on that early kochia. So if we're targeting winter annuals, we're applying the Valors sometime between September 1 and October 1. If we're targeting early kochia the next spring, we're putting it on later, October to late October. If we're targeting spring annuals, we're probably going to use Spartan because Spartan's better in the spring than Valor is. Now, I need to mention that a fall Valor may not be as effective if there's a lot of old crop residue out there. Okay, why can't we control some of these winter annuals and kochia with just this glyphosate burn down? Well, part of it is because we've got glyphosate resistant kochia. We've got glyphosate resistant horseweed, and glyphosate doesn't always control our prickly lettuce and hawksbeard. I'm going to jump through some of these slides here. Here we had Valor in the fall at 3 ounces, 91% control of kochia in May. Here's Spartan in the fall at 5 ounces, only 55. So that's why I say the fall Valor works a little bit better. Another product to consider in the spring burn down is something like a gramoxone metribuzin. We've seen this synergy between gramoxone and metribuzin works very well. This is a picture of a farmer who had some Valor in his tank and some extra Valor in his tank, and he just needed to empty it out. He sprayed out this one pass right here in the center of this field. This is a lentil field. Everything out here on this side and this side is kochia. Where he sprayed that fall Valor just to empty his tank, he cleaned up the kochia. This is also an example of how well a fall Valor works on a winter annual. This is false chamomile here, untreated versus treated over on this side. Here is kochia this is a kochia over here. This is treated. This is Valor metribuzin 2,4-D applied in the fall. This is horseweed. This is Valor on the left. So horseweed is a winter annual. The Valor in the fall helped clean that up. So in your spring burn down, your options are glyphosate, a glyphosate sharpen, glyphosate aim, gramoxone, a Spartan charge. You could go a gramoxone metribuzin, as I mentioned earlier, Spartan metribuzin. So those are your primary options. But if glyphosate's not working, then that leaves you with sharpen and aim which are not going to give you satisfactory control. You're going to have to use something else. Maybe consider a gramoxone metribuzin, a Spartan charge. But you also want to make sure you're targeting 1-inch kochia at the most. And we see less control with 3-inch kochia. Also, with your group 14 herbicides, group 14s like Sharpen, Spartan, Valor, Spartan Charge, apply those with an AMS MSO. Where we're applying those, the group 14s with AMS and MSO on emerged kochia, we're seeing much more effective kochia control. For example, here Spartan Charge plus MSO works much better than this glyphosate on this resistant kochia. Here's a 30 MTZ, which is Spartan plus metribuzin with MSO. Works much better than just glyphosate alone. Okay, I'm going to skip through Liberty. Okay, in Liberty canola, we can use Liberty in a burn down in front of Liberty canola. It has worked very well when you have those warm, sunny conditions. And the kochia is small. Here, in this trial, the kochia was no more than 2 inches tall, and it was very effective. Future considerations for research. I see Canada has these products labeled. Prospect, AIM plus Elevore, Armazon plus bromoxynil, Vita plus bromoxynil, AIM and bromoxynil. So other products that we need to consider. So just to wrap up then, so we're using Valor to thin out the kochia that emerges in the spring. And then that makes our burn down in the spring more effective. And then we have to rely on something else in the spring, such as a Spartan or another product, to give us the longer residual control in other crops, such as a pea. In canola, we're relying mostly on Roundup and Liberty to control the kochia. Anyway, I've taken up probably too much time, but I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or if I have time for questions.
Okay, is there any questions? One coming up here.
Considering what you said about kochia in a Liberty Lake system, you talked about Liberty and Select put together, and you also talked about resistance to Assure 2. Wouldn't you push more to 2-pass Liberty to be able to catch the kochia on the young side, and hopefully to get also on the second time to get any remaining things, and trying to get the Liberty early and then later on at maybe 6 leaf?
You certainly could do a split application to try and catch the early kochia. Make sure you get that kochia by the time it's 3 inches, and then you could come back later with your Select or Assure 2, whichever one you're using. Yes, you definitely can split those up, or you can apply the Liberty twice if you want, if you want to spend that money. But definitely a split application is possible. Most of the growers here that I'm aware of will tank mix the two and just go once in Liberty canola.
Any other questions? Brian, I guess
Okay, thank you.
Hold on a minute, Brian. Hold on. Where do you guys get your funding for all your research on these chemicals?
We get funding from the Northern Canola, from commodity groups such as the Northern Canola Growers. We get some funding from commodity groups who we have a minor use fund for pesticide use on minor crops. And then there's also federal funding for canola available as well.
Do you have a check off in North Dakota?
Yes, there is.
And do you tap into that for research?
Yes, the Northern Canola Growers Organization has money available for research through checkoffs, but also through the federal funding. There's your university people are familiar with it. There's a national grant that is typically available for researchers to tap into as well.
Any questions online? All right, well, thank you. Thank you for your time today.
Yep. Can I make one more comment?
Sure.
Okay, yes, the Beyond label definitely says you cannot plant canola the year after. I also want to point out, I forgot to mention when Tim was showing the crop rotation restrictions with Spartan, the Spartan Elite label says 12 months, whereas the other Spartan labels say 24 months. You certainly want to encourage your FMC reps to get that label changed, because canola does not need 24 months for you to wait to plant canola. It is that is definitely not necessary. We've shown that through research that it should be no more than 10 to 12 months. So, but it's just a label change that needs to happen. We've shared that data with FMC, but they just have to make the label change. So if you're using Spartan in front of a, well, you would probably be going with a small grain. Well, let's say you went with a small, okay, you can use Spartan in wheat. But then if we can get that label changed, you would be able to come back to canola the following year. So hopefully we can get that label changed. Thank you.